The First World War was meant to be the war that ended all wars. Instead, it became a conflict that transformed the very nature of human suffering. Industrial weapons, mass mobilization, and trench warfare produced destruction on a scale never before experienced. Yet while history often remembers the shattered landscapes of Europe, the rusting artillery, and the endless rows of white crosses, another battlefield existed, one that could not be photographed or mapped. It was the battlefield of the human mind. From this unseen front emerged a mysterious and terrifying condition that soldiers and doctors would come to call shell shock. When the war began in 1914, military planners believed it would be short. Soldiers marched off with confidence, encouraged by patriotic speeches and romantic visions of glory. But within months, the reality of modern warfare shattered these illusions. The Western Front hardened into miles of trenches stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. Soldiers lived underground like animals, surrounded by mud, corpses, rats, and the constant thunder of artillery. Days blended into weeks of unrelenting fear, where death could arrive without warning in the form of a shell falling from the sky. Artillery became the defining weapon of World War I. More soldiers were killed or wounded by shell fire than by bullets. Explosions were constant, day and night, pounding the earth, shaking the air, and assaulting the senses. Even when shells did not kill, they left behind something invisible yet devastating. Men began to break down in ways that could not be explained by physical injury alone. Some trembled uncontrollably, others lost the ability to speak, hear, or see. Many were paralyzed without any wound. These men were not cowards, nor were they weak. They were suffering from something no army was prepared to understand. The term shell shock first appeared in early 1915, coined by British psychologist Charles Myers. At first, it was believed to be a physical injury caused by the concussive force of exploding shells. Doctors assumed the blast waves damaged the brain or nervous system even when no external wounds were visible. This explanation seemed logical. Many soldiers displaying symptoms had been close to heavy bombardments. But as the war continued, cracks appeared in this theory. Men who had never been near exploding shells showed the same symptoms. Others collapsed far behind the lines, miles away from combat. The cause, it became clear, was not just physical, it was psychological. The symptoms of shell shock were varied as they were disturbing. Soldiers arrived at medical stations shaking violently, unable to control their limbs. Some stared blankly, unresponsive to commands. Others screamed in terror, reliving bombardments that had long ended. Many suffered from nightmares so intense they feared sleep itself. Speech disorders were common. Men stuttered, whispered, or became completely mute. Some walked with strange, jerking movements, while others curled into fetal positions, unable to stand. Military doctors were baffled. There were no visible wounds, no bleeding, no broken bones, yet these men were clearly broken. As casualty numbers rose, shell shock became impossible to ignore. By 1916, tens of thousands of soldiers were being removed from the front lines due to psychological collapse. The Battle of the Somme alone produced an unprecedented wave of mental casualties. Soldiers endured days and weeks of continuous shelling, watching comrades disintegrate beside them. Trenches filled with bodies, the wounded screamed for help that could not come, and the smell of death never faded. For many, the mind simply could not endure any longer. Despite the scale of the crisis, military institutions were slow to respond with compassion. Early attitudes toward shell shock were deeply influenced by pre-war beliefs about masculinity, discipline, and mental health. Mental illness was poorly understood and often associated with weakness or moral failure. Many officers believed shell-shocked soldiers were malingering, faking symptoms to escape duty. Others saw it as a failure of character rather than an injury. As a result, countless men were punished instead of treated. Some shell-shocked soldiers were sent back to the front after brief rest periods, only to collapse again. Others faced court-martial for desertion or cowardice. In the most tragic cases, men suffering severe mental trauma were executed. The British Army executed over 300 soldiers during the war, many of whom historians now believe were suffering from shell shock or similar conditions. Their stories remained buried for decades, victims not only of war but of misunderstanding. Medical treatment varied widely and often depended on the beliefs of individual doctors. Some physicians adopted humane approaches, offering rest, counseling, and reassurance. Others employed harsh methods designed to shock soldiers back into functioning. Electric shock therapy was sometimes used, particularly on men who had lost the ability to speak or walk. Patients were subjected to painful currents under the belief that fear would restore normal behavior. While a few men did recover, many were left further traumatized. One of the most influential figures in the treatment of shell shock was British psychiatrist W.H.R. Rivers. Working at Craig Lockhart War Hospital, Rivers treated officers suffering from war neuroses using a more compassionate method. He believed shell shock was a natural response to extreme stress, not a sign of weakness. Rivers encouraged patients to talk about their experiences, confronting repressed memories rather than suppressing them. His approach marked an early step towards modern psychotherapy. Among Rivers' patients were poets Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, whose writings would later shape public understanding of the war's psychological toll. Through their poetry, they revealed the inner devastation hidden behind medals and uniforms. Owen's verses spoke of nightmares, guilt, and the haunting presence of the dead. Sassoon openly criticized the war, exposing the disconnect between civilian optimism and the soldiers' reality. Their words gave voice to thousands who could not speak for themselves. As the war dragged on, military policy slowly evolved. Forward psychiatric units were established, closer to the front lines, based on the principle of PI, proximity, immediacy, and expectancy. Soldiers were treated near the battlefield as soon as symptoms appeared, with the expectation that they would recover and return to duty. While controversial, this approach reduced long-term disability for some. However, it also reinforced the idea that recovery meant returning to combat, not healing fully. By the war's end in 1918, shell shock had affected hundreds of thousands of men across all armies. Yet peace did not bring relief. Veterans returned home carrying invisible wounds that followed them for the rest of their lives. Many struggled to reintegrate into civilian society. Loud noises triggered panic, nightmares persisted, relationships suffered, employment was difficult to maintain. Governments were ill-prepared to support these men, and public sympathy often faded once the uniforms were put away. Shell shock forced the world to confront a difficult truth. War does not end when the guns fall silent. It continues inside those who survived. The condition challenged long-held beliefs about courage, masculinity, and the limits of human endurance. It revealed that even the strongest soldiers could be overwhelmed by prolonged terror and loss. In doing so, it laid the foundation for our modern understanding of psychological trauma. The legacy of shell shock would echo through future conflicts. Though the term itself would eventually be replaced by others, combat fatigue, battle exhaustion, and later post-traumatic stress disorder, the core reality remained the same. World War I had shown that the human mind could be wounded just as surely as the body, and those wounds, though invisible, could be just as deadly. As shell shock spread through the armies of Europe, It became clear that the condition did not discriminate by nationality. British, French, German, Austrian, Russian, and American soldiers all displayed the same haunting symptoms. Tremors, paralysis, muteness, nightmares, and emotional collapse appeared regardless of uniform or flag. Yet while the experience of trauma was universal, the responses to it varied dramatically depending on rank, class, and national military culture. Shell shock did not just expose the fragility of the human mind, it exposed the social divisions embedded within the armies themselves. One of the most striking differences in treatment was between officers and enlisted men. Officers were more likely to be diagnosed with war neurosis or neurasthenia, terms that carried fewer moral judgments. Their breakdowns were often attributed to exhaustion or excessive responsibility. As a result, officers were more likely to receive rest, psychotherapy, and longer recovery periods in specialized hospitals. Enlisted men, by contrast, were frequently labeled with shell shock in its most stigmatized sense. Their symptoms were more often interpreted as cowardice, lack of discipline, or weakness. This class-based divide reflected broader Edwardian and European social beliefs. Officers were typically drawn from educated, upper-class backgrounds and were seen as possessing refined nervous systems, ironically making them more sensitive and thus more prone to nervous collapse. Working-class soldiers, on the other hand, were expected to be physically and mentally tough. When they broke down, it challenged deeply held assumptions about masculinity and labor. Rather than questioning those assumptions, military authorities often blamed the men themselves. The pressure to return soldiers to the front created ethical conflicts within military medicine. Doctors were not only healers, they were also agents of the state. Their role was to preserve fighting strength, not necessarily to ensure long-term well-being. This dual responsibility shaped treatment decisions. Some physicians genuinely sought to help their patients, while others prioritized rapid cures that would send men back into combat as quickly as possible. Forward treatment centers became a cornerstone of this strategy. By treating soldiers close to the front, doctors hoped to prevent symptoms from becoming entrenched. Men were given food, rest, clean uniforms, and reassurance that their reactions were temporary. In mild cases, this approach worked. Soldiers stabilized and returned to duty within days. But for those with severe trauma, the expectation of recovery often became another burden. Failure to improve quickly could result in accusations of malingering and harsher interventions. Electric shock therapy, hypnosis, and forced physical exercises were used with disturbing frequency. Soldiers who could not walk were made to march. Those who could not speak were shocked until words returned. While some doctors believed these methods were effective, others condemned them as cruel and unethical. Medical journals of the time revealed heated debates about whether shell shock was a genuine illness or a disciplinary problem. These arguments played out in hospital wards, where vulnerable men became subjects of experimental and often painful treatments. In Germany, shell shock, known as Krieg Neurosis, was similarly controversial. German military psychiatry emphasized discipline and willpower, often viewing psychological collapse as a failure of character. Treatments were harsh and authoritarian. Patients were subjected to strict routines, punishment, and electric shocks designed to restore obedience. The goal was not emotional healing, but functional recovery. German doctors openly acknowledged that fear was a tool, believing it could override neurosis through conditioning. France took a slightly different approach but faced similar challenges. French doctors recognized the psychological nature of war trauma earlier than some of their counterparts, yet they too struggled with limited resources and military pressure. Treatment centers were overwhelmed, particularly during massive offensives like Verdun, where soldiers endured months of relentless bombardment. French soldiers described the sound of shells as an endless storm, one that never allowed the mind to rest. Many emerged from Verdun mentally shattered, their lives permanently altered. The American army entered the war late but learned quickly from European experience. By 1917, U.S. military planners were aware of shell shock and attempted to screen recruits for psychological vulnerability. However, these efforts were crude and largely ineffective. Once American troops entered combat, they suffered the same breakdowns as their European allies. American doctors adopted forward treatment principles but faced the same moral dilemma: heal or return to combat. For soldiers, the experience of shell shock was deeply isolating. Many felt shame over their symptoms, fearing they had failed their comrades. Others were haunted by guilt for surviving when friends had died. Survivor's guilt became a common and poorly understood aspect of war neuroses. Men relived moments when they believed they should have acted differently, moments frozen in their minds, replaying endlessly. The trenches themselves were designed to destroy mental resilience. Constant vigilance was required to survive. Soldiers slept lightly, always alert for gas attacks, raids, or sudden bombardment. This state of perpetual tension left the nervous system exhausted. Over time, the body remained in a state of alarm even when danger passed. What modern psychology would later describe as hyperarousal was already crippling thousands of men. Letters and diaries from the front reveal how soldiers struggled to articulate their experiences. Many avoided describing the worst moments, fearing that words could not capture the horror or that their families would not understand. Silence became a coping mechanism, both during and after the war. This silence, however, came at a cost. Unspoken trauma festered, shaping lives in ways that were invisible but profound. When the war ended, shell shock did not disappear. Veterans returned to societies eager to move on, to celebrate victory or mourn the dead, but not to confront the long-term psychological damage of survivors. Many former soldiers found themselves unable to hold jobs, maintain relationships, or sleep through the night. Loud noises triggered panic. Crowds felt threatening. Emotional numbness replaced joy. Governments struggled to classify and compensate these injuries, often minimizing their severity. Pensions for psychological wounds were difficult to obtain. Physical injuries could be measured and verified. Mental ones could not. Veterans were forced to prove their suffering repeatedly, reliving trauma in bureaucratic settings. Some were institutionalized for years, their war effectively continuing in asylums and hospitals. Others self-medicated with alcohol, contributing to social problems that extended beyond the battlefield. Despite the suffering, shell shock also became a turning point in the history of mental health. The sheer scale of psychological casualties forced doctors, governments, and the public to reconsider long-standing beliefs. The war demonstrated that trauma could overwhelm anyone, regardless of courage or background. It challenged the idea that mental illness was a personal failing and suggested instead that extreme circumstances could injure the mind. By the early 1920s, the term shell shock began to fade from official use, replaced by broader concepts of war neuroses. Yet the experience it described remained real and unresolved. The lessons of World War I would shape military psychiatry for decades, influencing how future wars approached psychological injury, even as new conflicts would repeat many of the same mistakes. Shell shock had revealed a truth that could no longer be ignored. Modern warfare had crossed a threshold. The mind, once considered invulnerable, had become a casualty of industrial violence. And as nations rebuilt their cities and economies, countless veterans were left to rebuild themselves, often alone, often misunderstood, and often forgotten.